That is not a war memorial. A 43-foot tall Christian cross does not memorialize non-Christian veterans. It's not a war memorial. It's the prominent symbol of Christianity. And when it was erected, back in the 20s, I think, nobody argued that it was anything but a Christian cross. They used to have Easter sunrise services there. They talked about how important it was for Christianity to have this symbol on this mountain top. But at some point, they wanted to keep it there because it was a problem. It was on government land. So they declared, oh, well, it's really a war memorial. It's not a war memorial. It's a cross. And either take it down or sell it to private entities. It should not be on government land. Now, there are some conditions under which religious organizations can use public land to display religious symbols. If you have a situation in front of the city hall and it's considered a free speech zone, and the Knights of Columbus put a creche there, and a Jewish group puts a menorah there, and an Islamic group puts its signs up there, and an atheist group puts its symbol there, they're paying for the display, they're maintaining it, they take it away when the holiday season is over. That's okay, as long as we understand everybody has access to that spot. Now here's where we're running into problems. In Florida, in the state capital, they decided a couple years ago that it would be nice to have a nativity scene in the rotunda during the Christmas season. But in order to do that, they had to open up the forum to every other group. But they were willing to do that. So they brought the Christian nativity scene into the rotunda, and then they brought in a menorah, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation brought in a nice sign explaining its views about reason for the season, and so on. And then things got a little more interesting. One gentleman decided that he wanted to erect a Festivus pole made out of beer cans. It was Pabst Blue Ribbon, if you're wondering. Festivus, yeah. So they grumbled and they said, oh, okay, we put the Festivus pole up. So we did. Then another group said, well, we'd like to put up a symbol honoring the flying spaghetti monster. And you probably can't see it here, but I've got the flying spaghetti monster on my lapel pin here. So I have been touched by his noodly appendage. But they put this up, and again, the state officials grumbled, and they said, oh, no, all right, fine. Then a group called the Satanic Temple approached them and said, we want to put up a diorama of Lucifer falling into the pit of fire. And they said, no, that's offensive. We're not going to do that. Well, you can't make those types of determinations. Now, as it turns out, the Satanic Temple, some of you may know about it, isn't really a satanic group in the pure sense of the term. They don't believe in Satan. They don't believe in God. They're a humanist group that believes in Satan as an archetype representing any individual who stands up to religious authority. Because Satan was the first rebel, if you think about it. So they sort of take that view. And we had to almost go into court and threaten a lawsuit to get them to allow this to be displayed. Now, it's going to be displayed a little bit later this month for a week in the rotunda. Now, my suspicion is next year they'll say, maybe we're going to come up with some new rules about no symbols being displayed in the rotunda, because some of these things they consider offensive. But the government is not in a position to say what's offensive and what's not when it comes to religion. Next thing we want to do is we want folks to understand that civil religion, what they call civil religion, that so many on the right prize so much, they'll go to the mat for this stuff. It is to us kind of bland and offensive. It's not something that everybody rallies around. It's not something that everybody accepts. So what I'm talking about here are when they slipped under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, when they started stamping "In God We Trust" on our money. This is not historical. I've talked to people on the religious right who really do believe that, George Washington sat down and he designed the first penny, and he put "In God We Trust" on the fringe, and then he put Abraham Lincoln's picture right on there, okay? Didn't work out that way, okay? First coins did not have that phrase. That is a Civil War era thing. During the Civil War, there was a minister in Pennsylvania who felt that the war was going badly for the North early on, you might remember, and that if the North would acknowledge God and its money, that God would reciprocate and turn the course of the war. So he suggested that the phrase "God is our trust" appear on coins. The Secretary of the Treasury liked the idea, but he tweaked the phrase to "In God We Trust." They started using it. Lo and behold, the fortunes turned, so it worked, in the war. And then we've been stuck with it ever since. In 1956, they slipped under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, the original pledge, as written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a minister and a socialist, by the way, did not have that phrase in it. They slipped that in there. Now, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, you're not forced to say it. You know, your kids, they can't be required to say the pledge in school. But, you know, the American Humanist Association has had to bring several cases recently standing up for the rights of students who were compelled to say it. But beside that, put that aside for a minute. What is the point of it? I've talked to religious people over the years and I've said, challenge them, do you really know anybody who was brought to a deeper, more appreciative understanding of faith because they saw "In God We Trust" on a nickel? I mean, is that really what you're after here? And what they're doing, I think, is they're trying to remind us, those of us who are skeptical of organized religion, that we're second-class citizens. I mean, think about that phrase, "In God we trust." In God we trust. One God, not 5 gods, not 20 gods, not no God. One God, something to be gained by trusting in this God, something to get, you're going to benefit if you do it. It's a good thing. Real Americans trust in this God. And if you don't, you may be a second-class citizen. So we would like to see, I think, a complete secularization in this area, not just the sort of midway point we're at now. Next thing I'd like to see is I'd like for religious organizations, and this may shock you, I'd like them to follow the law. I think that's, you know, not too much to ask. We're not allowed as a 501c3 organization to endorse or oppose candidates during election season. Churches do it all the time. They're not being penalized. They're not being having their tax exemption stripped away. All we want is for religious organizations to realize that in certain political realms, there are limits on what they can do. It's not too much to ask. They're not political action committees. And also to understand that there is a distinction between a religious entity, like a house of worship, and a for-profit entity. I mean, there are certain exemptions and privileges that religious organizations do get by dint of our First Amendment. You can't force a church to hire a woman if they don't believe in women clergy. You can't force them to perform the marriage ceremony of a same-sex couple. I'm not for anything like that. I'm for religious organizations determining for themselves how to run their own theological points of view. What I'm not for is the owner of a secular business to decide, because he's a Roman Catholic and is a conservative one at that, all of his employees must bow to conservative Roman Catholic dogma. That goes too far. That steps on the rights of other people. Next thing I'd like to see, and this one's going to be a bit of a challenge, I think, is for these organizations on the religious right to stop hyperventilating about every single thing they don't like being the end of the world, ushering in Armageddon, and sponsoring the end times. They have been saying this for years. They said it when the school prayer decisions came down. They said it when Roe v. Wade came down legalizing abortion. They said it when LGBT rights started to expand. And now they're saying it as more and more states are recognizing same-sex marriage. And the phrases that are being thrown around are startling. Words like fascism, chaos, the end of Western civilization. There was a religious right attorney named Matt Staver who said, it's the end of Western civilization. Did you ever get the feeling that sometimes these people have confused reality with a bad Nicolas Cage movie? And I realize a bad Nicolas Cage movie is a redundancy, but their problem is this constant claim, because of their strange interpretation of the book of Revelation, that everything is going to lead to the end of the world. You know, let's take a breather here. Now, I really hope that the Supreme Court extends the same-sex marriage ruling nationwide and that the right to marry is available to same-sex couples. You know, my marriage for 22 years has been a great thing, and I had to think about how I'd feel if my wife and I were driving across the country and we said, oh, now we're in Alabama. We're not legally married anymore. Step on the gas. We need to get to the next state where we're legally married. I mean, you just can't have a situation like that. It doesn't make any sense. And plus, there is a moral issue here. But I don't know what's going to happen with it. I mean, I hope the Supreme Court does the right thing. But even if they don't, we're going to get through it as a nation. We'll address the issue maybe through some other system, through the political system. We're going to survive this thing. And if it doesn't go the way the religious right doesn't like, well, they'll get through it too. Next thing I'd like to see them do is to stop making the words secular and secularism dirty words, because they are not. The secular state is not a state that is hostile to religion. It is not a state that has it in for religion. It is not a state that seeks to suppress religion. You know, there have been societies like that in our history. Soviet Russia, Red China, North Korea today, where you can't even open a house of worship. You can't read the Bible. You can't participate in religious activities. None of us are for that. We support the right of all religious believers to meet in their houses of worship and to pray and to do what they want, with the understanding that they have no right to impose their theology on us through government action. That's the simple rule. Look, you go to church, do what you want, I don't care, but don't take the power of the government and force your theology onto me or anyone else. So the secular state is the state, it's the mechanism that protects the freedom of conscience for everybody, believer and non-believer. It's not something that should be attacked. It is something that should be celebrated. And they don't seem to understand that. They have sought to make secularism a dirty word, to turn people against that principle. And there's a reason for that, because they would rather see a system that is theocratic in nature. Next thing I'd like to see, and this is the one that I think is going to be one of the more challenging ones, because we've been working on it for a number of years without a lot of success. I would like for the folks on the extreme religious right, the fundamentalists, to try to understand a little bit better where we are coming from, those of us in this room, when it comes to where we stand on theology and religion. Now, I say that because I don't think anybody in this room became a free thinker to annoy religious people. I think probably you came to the point you're at because of some type of intellectual challenge, some type of a moment where you started to think about where you were and if it made sense anymore. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people over the years at meetings like this, and the story that I get is usually something like this. Well, I was raised, fill in the blank, but then I started to have doubts, and I started to read things, or I started to talk to a friend, or I was challenged, and I couldn't really get answers for my question. I mean, that was my situation. I had 8 years of Catholic school. I was raised in an Irish Catholic area. I wanted to be a priest when I was a kid. About 17, I started to doubt. And when I took my doubts to the clergy, to the teachers in the school, their answers were not satisfying. Their answers were things like, well, those theological concepts you're grappling with are beyond our puny human understanding. You're not meant to know that. Only God can answer those questions. No, not good enough. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to really piss off the religious people now. I'm going to become an atheist. Yeah, I'll get them. No, it was an intellectual challenge, something that most of us grappled with very sincerely. I've talked to people who said, look, I didn't want to give up my faith, but I could not intellectually be anywhere else. Why can't they respect that and understand that we have come to this position through a lot of, should I say, soul searching? Now, people say to me sometimes, well, you know, this all sounds nice. All this secular state, this perfect system of separation. Well, can we get there? Can we do it? Well, I will say to you that there are countries doing it now. There are places doing it now. There are places that are a lot closer than we are. Yeah, it's a challenge. We have to constantly work on it. I get frustrated by Supreme Court reverses. We had a case at Americans United involving the prayers before the town council in Greece, New York. We lost 5-4, very disappointing. And then the Hobby Lobby decision again, 5-4. I keep looking at these 5-4 rulings. I'm very frustrated by them. But I also know that we have to keep at it. We have to keep fighting, because if we give up, who else will step up? So yes, we can get there. We can keep working. We can keep at it. And we have to keep remembering, too, that question, like going back to the one I opened up this talk with. What do you people want? Well, what we want is a full implementation of separation of church and state, not just talk. We want secular government, secular, not hostile. We want a state that has no opinion on theology. And I really mean that, no opinion on theology. I talked about in God We Trust earlier. That is the state having an opinion on theology. One God. Trust in that God. Valuable benefits from trusting in that God. That's not the government's job, to have an opinion on theology. And we want full freedom of conscience for everybody, where all religious and philosophical beliefs are on the same level playing field. And I mean that for everybody. Christians, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist. If the Christians have a right to open a house of worship in town, the Muslims do too, the Buddhists do too, the Hindus do too, and the atheists have a right to open up a center for their beliefs. Everybody treated equally. We want folks to realize that the argument that the government should embrace their theology, because it's the true theology, has been used simultaneously by theocrats and fundamentalists throughout history at all times, whether they are Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or so on. And it has been argued by them at every stage in history, every time a union of church and state has reared its head. Now, it's cited today by ultra-Orthodox people, by Catholics, by fundamentalist Protestants, by radical Muslims, and many others who are convinced that only they alone possess the truth. Sometimes I think about this as a fight between two visions. The vision of Constantine the Great and the vision of James Madison. Constantine's vision was one of church-state union, oppression, persecution, and imprisonment and death if you dared to disagree with what the state believed about orthodoxy. Compare that to Madison's vision. Freedom of conscience, liberty, and self-determination. Now, I look at that and I think, wow, that's pretty obvious. One of those visions is better than the other. But you know what? There are many people today who have backed the wrong guy and support Constantine's vision instead. So while I came here today to praise the secular state, to praise separation of church and state, and to praise you, I did not come here to fill your heads with false ideas or to give you false optimism. I am a little suspicious of some of the claims being made right now, that the U.S. is rapidly undergoing a period of secularization, that the millennials are abandoning religion in droves, that our country is on the verge of some kind of great social change. I was talking yesterday, a few days ago, to a gentleman with Pew Forum. They do a lot of good research about religion and what people believe about religion in this country. And he said, yeah, you know, the millennials, they aren't, if you ask them, their interest in religion is down. But statistically, 50% of them will go back to a faith community at some point in their lives. The retention rate for the nuns, as they're called, N-O-N-E-S, the people who say they have no religion, is not very good. Many of those folks at some point drift into some kind of a religious community. So yeah, we've still got quite a fight on our hands. And if you doubt that, all you need to do is look at the recent election results. So I did not come here to fill your head with false optimism. Now I did come here to tell you this, and I'll wrap up here. What makes you, people in this room, people in this movement, good and interesting is that you think about your life, and that gives you an edge. That is the hallmark of every humanist, atheist, agnostic, freethinker that I have ever met. That you don't just take things on faith, that you ask questions. And, interestingly, thinking about your life also means that you think about your death. And you know, we get one shot at this thing. One shot, because no paradise awaits. A couple of months ago, my wife attended a funeral of a coworker's mother. This was a very conservative, fundamentalist family at the funeral, and she came back and she was kind of surprised at some of the things she had heard at this funeral because it was Pentecostal in nature, and they allowed people to kind of get up and just say what was ever on their mind. One guy had read one of these books where like a 5-year-old kid falls down a well and goes to heaven for like half an hour or something. You know, there are all these books out there that are very popular on the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. Some kid's in heaven for half an hour, and he writes a book about it. And this particular kid in his book talked about how he had seen trees with fruit on them, that you could just pull the fruit off and it would taste like whatever you wanted it to taste like. And that was paradise, right? And then we think about some other versions of paradise we've heard from fundamentalist Islamic Muslims who think that they're going to get 72 virgins in paradise, and such things like that. Well, you know, we know better. I joke with my son, who's 17, about heaven. He likes Skittles, you know, the candy, Skittles. Heaven is a giant fountain full of Skittles. And no matter how many Skittles you eat, you never get tooth decay. Well, you know, we know there's no Skittles fountain. We know that there's one shot. It's here and it's now, and therefore we know not to blow it. How will you be remembered when you're gone? That is the big question. Will you be remembered for objects, for stuff, for things you compiled? Or will you be remembered for the content of your ideas, for commitment, for passion to a cause? Lay that groundwork now. Remember that it may not bear fruit for a number of years. You may not be here to see some of the benefits of the things you're doing right now, today, this year. But still lay the groundwork. And when we lose, do not give yourself up to despair. Do not cry out to a God and ask why. Do not lament. Instead, get back to work. Why do you go back to work? Because of that one shot that we have. And the knowledge that what we're fighting for is good and right and worthy of our dedication. So what do you people want? Well, as I've said, we want lots of things. We want a government that doesn't presume to make religious decisions for us. We want a culture that respects our right to challenge orthodoxy. And a society that treats the skeptic not as a pariah, but as something of a pundit. Someone to be celebrated. But there's more than that. We want the acknowledgement that our doubt is not a corrosive force. It's not dangerous. It is a thing to be embraced, celebrated, and welcomed in a free society. We do not question acts of faith to be rude. Well, maybe some of you do. I don't know. We ask questions because that's how you find things out. That's how you grow, that's how you learn, that's how you remain vital, that's how you remain alive. And maybe, just maybe, instead of some ill-informed TV preacher blaming us for all of the problems of society, we will be occasionally thanked, just once. Because often, if you look at our history, it is the values of humanism and non-belief that saved the day. Think about the centuries of religious war and discrimination that tore our societies apart. Humanist values said there was a better way, separation of church and state. Think about the periods when there was racial, ethnic, and national prejudice. Well, humanist values rebuked them by citing our common evolutionary origins. It's still here. Think about the days when ignorance and superstition plagued societies and kept people down. Humanist values lifted them up with science, art, and literature. You know, that is not a bad track record. I will stand by that. I am proud of it, and I hope you are too. And I want you to work to help many others to understand it and embrace it as well. Thank you.
Have you thought about getting women more involved with your crusade on the birth control issue? Because that will help you out a lot in your crusade.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes. We have been working very hard with various women's organizations to bring them into this. The unfortunate thing is, the Hobby Lobby ruling, which, as many of you know, sort of, was not a good ruling, and the results of the most recent elections are going to challenge us even more on this issue. I think what's really troubling for me as I look at this isn't just a matter of women, it's sometimes a matter of socioeconomic status. The women who have the types of jobs that are at risk of losing their access to birth control are people who work at places like Hobby Lobby. Minimum wage, part-time, low wage, without a lot of good benefits. So they could lose that benefit. A lot of women who work in more professional jobs, they're not going to really seriously face that loss. What I don't understand is why we can't get those individuals linked up together. Even though you're not personally at risk of losing your benefit, you should still stand up for those who are. And we've been challenged to get some folks to do that, to be honest.
But see, that's where a lot of women groups, or like even men that participate in those groups, if they all come together, that will help out a lot.
Absolutely.
Yes, we're new to this group, my husband and I, and we just had an event. We belong to the Business Association in Luna Pier, Michigan, and we had an empty bowls event for a charitable for food and for the hungry. And we made a lot of money, $5,300, our first event, and we gave it all to 7 religious organizations because that's all everybody had. And I want to know if there's any atheist ones we could send to with no agenda, no prayers you have to give. Are there? I don't know. I'm new.
Yeah, there are a couple of non-belief themed charities. What they normally do is they collect money and then they parcel it out to, like, say, the Red Cross, which, despite its name, isn't a religious charity provider. Foundation of Non-Belief. Council for Secular Humanism in New York, they run one. The American Humanist Association runs one. The names are escaping me at the moment, but if you go to their websites, you can find that information.
Okay, thank you.
First, I'd like to thank you for a very excellent talk. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I'm a little concerned, and I know it's shorthand to do it this way, but in some cases you sort of lumped atheist organizations in with religious ones. For instance, in the Florida case, we had the Catholics and Mormons or whatever, and the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and the atheists. But isn't there a fundamental distinction between our type of group and a religious group? You know, we aren't just another religion without a God. We are very definitely a qualitatively different organization.
That's a very good question, and it's a very controversial question. There are some people in the non-belief community who are very adamant that atheism should never be treated the same as a religion, should never seek the same benefits as religion. Now, that's a road you can go down. But if you go down that road, then you won't get equal access in cases like access to the Florida Rotunda. You won't get access to prisons. If there are non-believers in prison and they want programs, you won't be able to get access to help them. You won't be able to get into certain educational institutions. I'm not crazy about it, but generally speaking, I think what we're seeking is courts saying that while atheism is not a religion, it is, from a legal standpoint, entitled to the same benefits, privileges, and access that religious organizations have. Even tax-exempt status. So you have to, in some ways, to get some of these benefits, to get some of this access, be willing to at least concede that atheism, while it's not a religion, is legally equivalent to it. I know it's controversial, but that's the only way you're going to get some of this access that we're seeking.
I'm wondering about, say, religious hospitals, religious universities. They receive government dollars, Medicare, Medicaid, Pell Grants.
They sure do.
They're not really houses of worship, although they may have icons all over the place that they seem to be allowed to have there. How is their reporting covered?
Well, it would depend on those institutions. It would depend on their tax status. If they are legally 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, then they would be required to fill out some of those forms that I talked about, because they're not a house of worship. They're what's called a religious organization, a religiously affiliated entity. The interesting thing about some of those entities right now is, as you point out, they receive a lot of tax support. If you think about private Catholic colleges, private Christian colleges, they get a lot of government support, and so do religious hospitals. Yet they're never really willing to bend to oversight and regulation. Catholic hospitals, for example, obviously they don't provide abortion, they don't provide birth control, they won't perform certain operations. They will even override your advance directives if they believe that the advance directive in your living will is in violation with Catholic doctrine. So that is a real problem. You're talking about a taxpayer-funded institution that is imposing dogma on people who may not even belong to the faith, yet they're getting a lot of that aid. That has been challenged because there's been a trend in the past few years of hospital mergers. Non-sectarian hospitals merge with Catholic hospitals. Public hospitals merge with Catholic hospitals. When that happens, the non-sectarian or the public hospital assumes those same religious rules and imposes them on people, and that is a very big problem. Great. Thank you.